All right, Avalonians, welcome back. I'm going to talk to you today about some key terms going forward with the semester: liberalism and its limits, classical and otherwise. Really, liberalism is the main term of this presentation to help you get a handle on what it actually means, what it's meant, and how it's been largely emptied of its meaning, but also conservative, its counterbalance is very similar. So it's important to have discussions. Remember, when you're going to discuss things with people, you always got to start by defining terms, and that's just good practice, right? But this is a particularly loaded term or tricky term because it means so many different things. It's hard to have a fruitful discussion with people, whether you agree or disagree with them. All right, so liberalism and liberal have become almost useless today, even as political terms, which is their most common use. Sometimes it has social terms as well, social meanings. But what is meant by the word liberal in 1900 meant about its exact opposite by 1990. By that I mean, in the 1800s and early 1900s, a classical liberal would have been typified by the views of guys like Thomas Jefferson and Adam Smith. People that wanted small government that interfered as little as possible in the daily lives of its citizens, low taxes, very little regulation, to leave people as free as possible. Contemporary liberals, you see Barack Obama, Bernie Sanders, Ted Kennedy, if you remember him, never met a regulation they didn't like and are very comfortable with government telling people how to live every aspect of their lives, from the fact that you have to buy health insurance or you have to be taxed for this or that or whatever. So it means almost the exact opposite, but the same terms used. There's a historical process to that, but it's an important thing you should know that it meant very different things. Now, as Americans living here and now, it's very important to have clarity in your mind about how the terms are used and abused. Right? Now, liberal is usually opposed by the term conservative, right? Which is, again, it's mostly a word that's become useless until you get more context in the terms of any particular discussion. Liberal today tends to go with a political program also known as progressive, which tends to include support for the welfare state, the idea that government should take care of you from the cradle to grave, a rejection of traditional views of marriage and sexuality, the idea that a marriage is for life, that you should be faithful to your spouse, that sex should be part of marriage, and that's pretty much it, or, at least it's the goal. That there are government limits on natural rights, especially property. Taxes are basically government compelling you to give some of your property to the government. And then extensive regulation of the economy. That's kind of the progressive program. Most liberals support that. Liberals are generally perceived to be on the left of the political spectrum. Sometimes they're called leftist. Conservatism, as it's generally used, is meant to be the opposite, right? Generally, it's supposed to be for those who tend to reject the idea of the welfare state, at least to the same degree as the liberals want it, right? That's a smear. You've got to be careful to say it's a smear to say that they don't care about people. A lot of conservatives care deeply about their fellow human beings. They just don't want mandatory, compulsory programs to make them be taxed for welfare type of programs. These people prefer private, voluntary things. Now, until the presidency of Barack Obama, it was generally American conservatives who supported sending American forces into action around the world. When I was a youth in the 70s and 80s, it would have been the mark of a liberal to oppose sending troops anywhere like the Vietnam War or what have you. And really, it started to change somewhat with Bill Clinton, but although Barack Obama ran on the platform of really criticizing President Bush's handling of the Iraq War and Afghanistan, he didn't withdraw troops from any place. He even sent them into Libya and other places, and the liberals stopped complaining about it in the United States. And that's been one of the changes. Conservatives do tend to have a traditional view about marriage and family life, and they tend to want less government involvement in daily life. Conservatives are perceived as being on the right of the political spectrum. I think the spectrum, as it's generally thought of, is not that helpful, but it's the terms that are thrown around all the time, whether you're going to open up the pages of the Washington Post or you flip on your news channel. They use these terms left and right, so you need to know how they're used. And I'm hoping that just by listening to this presentation today, it'll help you to be confident in rejecting the terms as well. Contemporary conservatives, this is a mix, by the way. Ronald Reagan is considered the epitome of modern conservatism because he ran on a small government platform. Although government grew a small amount during his presidency. Well, I shouldn't say small amount, but probably much less than it would have under anyone else. George W. Bush was called a conservative left and right. He has a program he called Compassionate Conservatism. But he never met a government program he didn't like. He was a very different type of conservative, if you want to call him that, than Ronald Reagan was. But these are people, when people talk about conservatives, that's what they're talking about. The term certainly has more meaning when it comes to Reagan than it did with George W. Bush. Now, the word conservative comes from the word conserve, right? To save, preserve, retain. And the idea is that it tends to reject or be hesitant about political changes because there's a lot of good things in the past. You have a heritage, for example, look at the United States. You have a heritage of liberty. You have a heritage of prosperity mostly. And you have a heritage of a growing perception of human rights. These are good things. You want to keep them, right? Also, a conservative tends to recognize that any particular change is at least as likely to be bad as it is good, perhaps even more so likely to be bad than good. And so there's the idea, let's not change things very quickly, right? The total opposite of a conservative would be a radical, like the radicals of the French Revolution, who wanted to totally usher in a totally new society. Now, the tricky thing about these terms tends to be when a change, which was opposed by conservatives, becomes part of the program and is there for a little while, does it automatically become what's to be preserved in the future? If it just conserve means you preserve what's here, what if it's a bad thing that became here? Things like Social Security in the 1930s, the scheme that President Roosevelt used to really grow the government and to cement the New Deal into American politics, was opposed by the conservatives of the time. But now conservatives assume it's part of the woodwork and actually tend to defend it. Edmund Burke, famous English statesman, is considered the founder of conservatism. And he wrote several tracts and gave addresses in Parliament, reflections on the Revolution in France. See that picture? You might remember it from the Reign of Terror in France. And basically, this is the idea, when you get change and this radical changes in society, it might be bad. Okay, the word liberal comes from liberty. Liber, Latin for free. Right? Think liberate, liberty, right? Like the word libertarian is used now. Now you should note the irony that the modern political liberals in favor of government restrictions on virtually all forms of business, civic, and increasingly personal life, right? Whereas a libertarian is closer to what a classical liberal would have been. If you're in my class, you know I'm very sympathetic. I describe myself as a political libertarian or a minarchist. Someone who wants as minimum government as possible. But we say, what do you mean by this in the classical liberal tradition, right? Well, you have that copy of the Declaration of Independence, We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among them are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Now, Thomas Jefferson borrowed those words from John Locke, right? Life, liberty, and property is the way Locke phrased it. Okay, and the idea that there are certain rights and people should be free to use to exercise those rights without interference from the state, unless you're interfering in someone else's rights. So the classical liberal means something much more like the modern conservative, like a Ronald Reagan, right? The idea that there are natural rights and they support limited government, right? This is good from a Catholic point of view, by the way. They're natural rights. Nature, of course, meaning what you are, and just by being a man or a woman, right, that we're created in God's image and likeness, and certain rights flow from that they're not the gift of a particular government. These things are enshrined in the United States Declaration of Independence, and even in our founding documents like the Constitution, that idea that there should be freedom of religion, right? Freedom of conscience, freedom of conscience. We'll get to that later in the presentation. There are problematic elements of liberalism, even though there are good elements, right? And classical liberalism, for some, also can have very anti-Christian elements, right, that are rooted in the pride, the hubris of the Enlightenment. Remember, Enlightenment is a whole philosophical trend that moves away from the idea of revelation, that God would reveal something and propose something for man's belief. It's a rejection of the supernatural. And this idea of liberalism coming from free, some would say that man is free to decide for himself what is good or not good. Right? We say as a Catholic there's something off about that. You can decide for yourself what you're going to do, but you can't decide whether that action is in itself good or bad. For example, when you provide for your family, that's a good thing, right? It is good, and you do it. You don't make it good. Now, as part of this, some say that the state should not establish a state religion or an official church because it's a private matter. Okay, there's some good to that also, but if religion is only a private matter, it's hard to exercise in public, right? So if religion is a private matter, then the question arises as to how much it should direct society. Some say religion should not affect interactions between people. It should be kept to yourself, right? It'd be kind of a crazy religion that had no effect on how you lived your life with other people, though. Other pernicious isms follow when you take these ideas to their logical conclusion, like indifferentism, relativism, etc. The hippies there for indifferentism or relativism. Indifferentism is this idea that one religion is as good as another. Another way of saying that all religions have an equal chance of helping someone get to heaven, right? They're more or less the same. And, it just doesn't make sense logically, since we know that religions teach different things, right? Even just the branches of Christianity. There's some key thing: is faith, salvation by faith alone, or by faith and works? It can't be both. They're equal, right? It can't. One's one, one's the other. They conflict. One has to be. They both can't be equally right. I suppose things could be equally wrong, but when you definitely conflict, it doesn't make any sense, right? So the idea, it doesn't matter what religion a man or woman professes. And it doesn't matter that much. That's where indifferentism really starts to creep in. It's very part of our modern fabric of life, isn't it? Okay, one helpful way to think about it, this is freedom of conscience as opposed to freedom of consciences. Now, freedom of conscience, as a Catholic, we say, is a bad thing. There's something off about it. I'll explain in a minute. Freedom of consciences, no, that's a good thing. So what's the difference between freedom of conscience and freedom of consciences? Well, freedom of conscience implies that each conscience, each person can determine for himself what is good or true. Right? And you can't make up your own truth. You might have your own opinions about things, but truth is where the mind meets reality. You don't make reality. You're born into a certain world. You're born into a situation. You have to accept reality. You perceive reality. You discover reality. You might be better at it than your neighbor, figuring it out, but you don't make it so, right? Whereas freedom of consciences says that each conscience should be free to live as best it can without being coerced into violating that conscience, say, by the government or by other people. Okay? Now this implies, okay, so that he's free to worship according to the dictates of their consciences. So that would mean, like when Avalon and Maryland were founded, the Calverts wanted, it was open to Protestants. These colonies were open to Protestants. If you were a Protestant and you really thought that was the fullness of truth, they would not impose Catholicism on you, even though they were not neutral about it, because Catholicism has the fullness of truth. Okay, but it wouldn't be imposed. That's freedom of consciences. It's a distinction that's really important. Down in St. Mary's City today, there's a statue right next to the St. Mary's River. I went to college down there. It's called Freedom of Conscience, and it's a kind of attractive statue of a guy coming out of the water. But really, it's kind of a mistaken idea, the way the statue presents it. All right, now, by the way, so again, to sum up, the conscience can discover or figure out what is right. It does not determine what's right. This presupposes that a conscience needs to be formed well, in accordance with the faith and wisdom and things like that. Okay, so this is a famous image of the Pilgrims, right? Now, why is that in here? Well, in America and Europe, you have different dynamics involved with this notion of religious liberty. Okay? In America, there are many different religious groups living relatively peacefully with each other, right? And these groups took their faiths very seriously, like the Pilgrims that founded Plymouth and then Massachusetts. And then Rhode Island, of course, is founded when Roger Williams leaves Massachusetts because he had some different puritanical ideas than they did in Mass. So he starts his own colony for religious liberty later. Right. Pennsylvania was started by William Penn, and of course Avalon and Maryland by the Calverts, for Catholics, and others. Right. And really Avalon was the first English colony with this idea of religious toleration. But the idea is, of course, that people ought to be free to worship according to their consciences, and there ought not to be, it doesn't say that, the state ought not to establish a particular religion or an official church. Right, that was the idea. It's not competent to do so. It's not what it's good at. Right? There's images of Maryland, the Calverts here, and other images that are associated with Maryland. There's Calvert as well. Okay, keep in mind that Europe, coming from the ancient regime, recognized the importance of religion in general to society, that there be a community that it starts, shared values, shared belief systems, and everything else. This is why sometimes the Holy Roman Emperor would call for a crusade against really elements of society that really undermine the unity, like the Albigensians in southern France. Okay, because it undermines that. But there's a problem here too, is, when there's a degree of coercion involved when you have state-run or state-supported churches, right? Especially after the wars of religion following the Reformation. The prince would tax you, and your taxes would be used to support the church. And you might be allowed a certain amount of freedom to worship on the side, but you're still paying for that church. Okay. So allowing religious liberty might be construed as a denigration of faith, too, right? That's not that important. You can worship whatever you want. It doesn't matter, right? And some people look at that as a bad idea of toleration. It means there's nothing really right or wrong, right? You tolerate everything. That's not what tolerance is supposed to mean either. Incidentally, tolerance is supposed to be the putting up with a lesser evil for the sake of a greater good, right? This is the indifferentism anyway. In Europe, the religious liberty tended to have more of that element to it. Okay, so you do see the distinction we need to make here and now, okay? Now, how does it play out? Okay, well, look, as a Catholic, right, we believe that the faith is so important that it must be chosen freely, right? It cannot be forced, right? We also believe that it's true. We also believe that due to the dignity of man or woman, created in the image and likeness of God, that he or she ought to be free to worship according to his conscience, right? Doesn't mean whatever you feel like, but whatever you think is truly right. Now, someone coerced or forced to accept the faith has not made an acceptable, an authentic choice, right? Which is why we've never endorsed conversion by the sword. And that's been tried a couple times. Charlemagne tried to convert the Saxons by the sword in Germany. But the church rebuked him, says you can't do that. People have to say yes to their own accord. Okay? Now look, put this in perspective. Let's consider friendship, right? You know, you're a believing Catholic for the purpose of this discussion, right? You accept the fullness of the faith. You believe, right? And you have friends, right? You have a friend. You care about your friend. You want your friend to be saved, to go to heaven, to accept the truth. You share what you consider to be true. Okay? You propose it to him because you care about him, right? You care about this person. You care about their salvation. You care about the health of their soul. And therefore, you don't just ignore this kind of stuff. You have some conversations over time, and you hope that he says yes to Jesus Christ, right? Becomes a Catholic. Okay, so you eventually maybe use words, maybe it's just through your actions, but you propose this ideal to him, but he's got to say yes freely, right? And the same thing applies to everything. You know, like if you're blessed with children at some point, you know, you don't want to be neutral about these things. If you believe the faith is true, you want your children to embrace it. This is how they're going to be happy. Anyone you love, right? So you recognize they have to make free choices, but it's not the same as being indifferent. You care very much that they make the right choice. All right, so let's back up for a second and review what the word faith means, right? Everyday garden variety faith is simply accepting something as true based on the testimony of another. Right? So if you, in the apologetics class, we talked about using Google Maps. If you're given the address of some place your friend's never been to, you check Google Maps and you trust that set of directions is right. So you're going to get there. Faith is involved with something that's beyond your experience, your direct knowledge. Right? Once you go to the person's house, you know where he lives, you've been there, you've walked there, you've seen it yourself. You don't need faith anymore, you have knowledge. Right? Faith, by its very nature, is something that you can't prove by direct experience. Right? So it involves accepting something unproven. So with matters of religion, right, you believe this to be true. You're not going to demonstrate it scientifically because it's not that type of thing. Right? And so you put it in front of your friend and they have to say yes. Okay, so Christian faith, then, is belief in God and always revealed that the Holy Catholic Church proposes for belief. Okay, now in a pluralistic society, though, conflicts arise, maybe between different groups, between the beliefs of different groups, the attitudes, the behavior, the actions. Who judges between the different religious groups? And you say, what do you mean by judge? That'd be a fair question. You should say, you know, you're judging the groups or you're judging their actions, right? Okay, so we say, well, the state, I would say, would rightly judge the actions and rights of the individuals of different groups, right? My parish happens to be in a largely Jewish neighborhood, right? It's not a problem at all, of course. But if it ever were, like, you know, does our right to worship on a Sunday interfere with their right to worship on a Saturday? Well, that would be messed up if it did, right? Or vice versa. Right? Okay. But the state is not qualified to judge the trueness, right? The rightness of Christianity or Judaism, right? It just doesn't know better. You know, the state is not competent in that thing. The people in government are not competent in that thing. Okay, well, modern states, right, place themselves above religion, right? And there's this false pretext of neutrality about it. You know, separation of church and state, like there's like it's separate from religion. There's no bias involved. I say it's false because by saying that you can't have religion in society if it's purely a private matter, the state is taking a position. It's saying that either there is no God, or if there is a God, he's not important. You know, what is important is that you disobey the state. Right? So it's impossible really to be fully neutral or relative on these matters. Right? And what people that say that they're neutral about religion is not really, they're forcing an irreligion. Right? Now, if the Christian claim is true, right, this is absolutely absurd, of course. Right? What's the source of the state's legitimate authority? Well, God, of course. What's the source of the existence of the state, or the people that make up the state, or the earth, that the land the state occupies? Of course, it's God himself. So it wouldn't make sense. Right? And this is why, as a Catholic, you can't support all aspects of liberalism, either modern, right, especially some of the modern things, or classical. Okay, in classical liberalism, right, we say we can fully embrace the natural law and the natural rights that come from that. That men and women have an intrinsic dignity because they're created in God's image and likeness. And because of that intrinsic dignity, there's certain rights to life, liberty, property, right? And they shouldn't be infringed upon. We do have certain duties that go with those rights too, of course, right? This just entails a proper respect for the free nature of man. Like I said, from my own personal views, which you do not have to accept, of course, here, I'd say I'm a minarchist regarding the amount of laws in society. I think it should be interfere with people's liberty as little as possible. And I think there should be as small a role for governments as possible, because that honors people's freedom as much as possible. Now, where you draw those lines, is likely to be different. Maybe, maybe not, but that's something in society it's always worth discussing. The free nature of man has limits, though. We didn't make ourselves. While you're free to choose actions, you can't define those actions. The old saying is you can choose to pick up the stick, right? But you can't choose to pick up one end of the stick without the other, right? So you can choose the actions, but you can't choose the consequences of those actions. If I jump off the front porch, right, I can choose to do that. But once I do that, I don't have a choice about whether I'm going to land on the ground or not, right? That's just part of the reality. That's the consequence of the jumping, right? And so this idea that a person could choose what's right or wrong, that doesn't make any sense, right? That's false. These are false ideologies. And so the limits of man's freedom are built into creation. And so we should be as free as possible, but we're not free to determine for ourselves what is right, what is wrong, what is true. We have to discover those things. Okay, now for the limits of contemporary liberalism or progressivism. Catholics are free to disagree about the levels of government involvement in political life, how much economic regulation on businesses, environmentalism. We should care about these things, right? But we are obligated. We must respect the natural rights of human beings and acknowledge God's preeminence in the world. So to say that there is no God politically would be messed up, obviously, but also to respect the right to life, okay, and freedom of consciences, for parents to educate their children. Things like that are not negotiable for the Catholic, with supporting the right to life and the rights of parents and education, things like that. Those two things in particular have to be supported by Catholics. All right, gentlemen, that's a wrap. Take it easy.